The creep is back! Although that's a really weird sentence out of context. Hey everybody, Ryan Reed here, and today I'm reviewing Creepshow, Shudder's series based on the 1980 films of the same name. If you're unfamiliar with Creepshow, they were two movies. The first one was written by Stephen King based on some of his stories, directed by George Romero, makeup effects by Tom Savini, and it was released in 1982, and it's an anthology film. It's based on the old EC comics, so if you're familiar with those, if you're familiar with like the Tales of the Crypt TV series, which is based on similar comics, or things of that nature, then you kind of get the idea of what this movie was. Creepshow was originally supposed to be kind of reminiscent of these old EC comics from the 50s and the 40s, things like that, where they dealt with horror tales. You know, they were comics with morality tales, with monsters and creatures and maniacs and all kinds of crazy stuff. They made two movies. Technically, I mean, there is a third movie, but ignore that. Creepshow 3 has nothing to do with the other two movies, and somebody just slapped the name Creepshow 3 on it to make a little bit of extra money. Avoid it. There are only two Creepshow movies that are truly Creepshow movies. Creepshow 1, like I said, 1982, and Creepshow 2, I believe, is 1987. Same staff, general staff, different director. But Stephen King stories adapted by George Romero for the screenplay. Really, really, really great movies. They're two of my favorite anthology movies of all time. If you're unfamiliar with that kind of concept, basically the idea is that it is a comic book kind of brought to life with these wraparound segments, and they have, in the first movie, it's 5 different stories that kind of are these, again, these horror tales, little bite-sized, 25, 30-minute horror tales. The second movie has 3 different stories. Well, it turns out that they wanted to bring it to life as a television series, and it's brought to us by Greg Nicotero. If you know anything about him, he's currently the showrunner on The Walking Dead. But for me, I'm more familiar with him as part of one of the founders of K&B Effects, which, if you are a fan of movies from the 80s and 90s, K&B is probably involved in somehow. If it's practical effects, K&B is there. And so Greg Nicotero was a name I knew already. And he had a tie with George Romero. Again, this is all stuff I want to talk about probably in a Fright Films episode, so I'm kind of trying to give little bits and pieces just to kind of set you up so you know what the show is. But basically, he had worked with Romero and Savini and all those guys. He had visited the set of Creepshow, and so he's kind of brought it full circle, and he's turned it into an anthology TV series for Shudder. And it's kind of got the same vibe, and overall, I think it's a fairly good anthology series. I say that a little hesitant, but it shows promise. This is only the first season. They did 6 episodes, and there are 12 stories within that as a total, each directed by different directors. And I think overall the series, like I said, shows promise. They did announce that a season 2 was going to be happening, and AMC is actually just about to start showing them in May. May 4th, I think, they're going to be showing it on TV. So if you don't have Shudder and you haven't checked it out yet, definitely you can check it out on AMC, and that's kind of why I wanted to do this review. I knew it was coming up again soon, so maybe it'll start gaining an even bigger audience as well, even though the series was already hugely successful. Again, as I said, the show has promise. There are some great episodes in here, but I think its biggest flaw at the moment is a lack of a unified vision. Creepshow 1 was directed by Romero and written by King, and it was their vision together that made one thing. So each of the episodes, each of these segments, I should say, in the movie, even though they're different, they feel like they're part of the same comic. The styling, there's like pop backgrounds that happen where they kind of have this like artistic background behind them. They used a lot of light gels, so like you'll get contrasting colors. So maybe a scene will be, there will be a blue filter on people, a blue lighting gel, and they'll have an orange background and make it pop and make it feel like a comic book brought to life. And not in the way of like superhero movies, and more like this is a frame of the comic brought to life. And that's why the Creepshow films were both so successful, is they do that really fairly well. And here, it's there, but I think the show struggles with its identity. It's got different directors on every episode. Some of the directors, direct multiple episodes. So, each one has its own voice, which is a cool concept, but doesn't always completely work. I think the show also struggles because it's trying to decide, does it want to be a continuation of the original movies, or does it want to kind of be its own thing? And it's a tough balancing act, and the show, at least in this first season, hasn't completely found its footing in that. Like I said, each of the 6 episodes have 2 segments within them, and I applaud them for trying to kind of, again, keep that Creepshow vibe, but it doesn't always work, because here's the problem. The Creepshow movies, again, you got multiple segments, and there isn't a bad one in the bunch, in my opinion. I love all the segments in Creepshow 1, I love all the segments in Creepshow 2. Creepshow 1 always feels a little long to me. I think it's a 2-hour movie, so by the time I'm done with the 3rd segment, I start feeling a little bit fatigued. That doesn't make it any less of a movie. I still love the movie, but I think the pacing in Creepshow 2 is a little bit better. But anyway, besides the point, I applaud them for doing something different, because a lot of anthology shows, it's one segment per episode. So Twilight Zone or, Tales from the Crypt or any of those shows where it's like each episode is its own unique story. Here, they're doing 2 stories in a 45-minute episode. So each episode is roughly, like 22 minutes, like the length of a half-hour TV show. And that's good and bad. It's good because it does try to keep with that theme of Creepshow being multiple stories, and it separates itself from the other anthology series out there. It's bad, however, because if you have 2 bad episodes, you're sitting through an hour of TV and it feels like you just sat through there were episodes that dragged because of that. So, and even if, let's say, the first segment is really not great, but the second segment's great, well then you gotta wait and sit through that first segment to get to the good segment. Or it's the opposite. You have a really great first segment, and you're like, awesome, and then the second segment isn't as good, and so it's kind of a letdown, and it leaves the episode off on like a bad taste. So part of me wishes they would have done each segment was its own episode, and I think that would have worked a little bit better, because if you watch a bad episode, even though it's ultimately the same runtime, you've got either half-hour episodes or hour-long episodes, and if you're binge watching it, ultimately that's the same. It feels the same. But there's something about knowing you're sitting down to watch an hour episode and having it be bad segments. Whereas if you watch one bad segment and a half-hour one, you can turn it off, you can come back to it later. And it feels like you still had a complete episode rather than stopping an episode in the middle. And so I think that's kind of it's a pro and a con. I think if they can start getting stronger stories in season 2, I think that'll really help, and it'll, again, keep that identity of Creepshow going, but they really have to kind of step up their game with some of their storytelling, I think. And that's not to say that every episode is terrible. In fact, there's only one episode of the bunch that I really didn't like, and even that has some positive moments. But again, a lot of it is a struggle because it's unclear if, some directors feel like they're really familiar with Creepshow and they're trying to honor the movies. Other directors feel like they've never, whether this is true or not, it probably isn't, based on kind of the history of some of these directors I was looking up. A lot of them have either worked with Romero or, are familiar with the films or things like that. But there are definitely segments that feel like this person doesn't understand what makes a Creepshow segment a Creepshow. In my opinion. Now, again, if you were to look at some of these segments as just a separate anthology series, let's say it was something not tied into Creepshow at all, I would, I probably wouldn't be as critical of them. But with it being Creepshow specific, I want it to feel like Creepshow. Creepshow feels different than any other anthology series out there. It feels different from, like I said, like Tales of the Crypt, or even Tales from the Dark Side, which was also brought to us from Romero. It still feels different from that. And so, I really want it to feel like Creepshow, and some of these segments don't. They feel like they're out of a totally different anthology series. And that's tough. That balancing act, again, is kind of thrown off. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to the fact that it doesn't feel like these directors were on the same page. Some of them really want to do big homages. They want it to feel like the movie. They use those same kind of backgrounds. They use a lot of practical props. They do, these kind of morality tales that each of the segments in the Creepshow movies were. Ultimately, the Creepshow movies, since they're based on those old DC comics, they always kind of had some moral twist. It's about somebody getting revenge, or it's about somebody getting their comeuppance if they're a bad person, things like that. And so that's what these segments all felt like in the original Creepshow movies. Here, we don't always get that. Sometimes it just feels like a spooky story to be a spooky story, and so it doesn't really fit in with the theming. And some of them aren't even scary stories. Some of them are just, well, we'll get into that. But that said, like I said, I think there are some really solid segments in here. And nothing is except for one segment which I really didn't like, which, by the way, I've seen, after I finished the series, I looked up some other lists, and there are people out there who have a very different opinion, and my least favorite episode may be your favorite episode. So if that's the case, that's okay. That's the great thing about an anthology series, is you can like one thing and then not like another, but you can also like the series, and that makes it awesome. So definitely let me know in the comments down below, if you've watched Creepshow, what your favorite segment is from the series, or the movie. What's your favorite segment that you've seen of any of the Creepshows so far? To me, there are a few definitive segments, if you're going to sit down and watch this show, that you need to watch. The first is the House of the Head. Now, this comes as the second part of the first episode. The first half is fine. The second segment, I think, is way stronger. I definitely think this is not the most Creepshow feeling segment, but to me, it is the creepiest segment of all of them. And I debated on reviewing every segment, but I think I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to avoid spoilers as much as I can so you can kind of enjoy them. Let's just say this one is the simplest in the way that it's told and the way its effects work, but my God, is it the creepiest. I watched it and it made me just feel... It's got a very eerie vibe to it, and none of the other segments quite reach that. Some of them reach more tongue-in-cheek kind of vibe that Creepshow actually, the movies have. They're all kind of tongue-in-cheek, none of them are particularly scary, but this one definitely stands out on its own as just pure creepy. Except for a lame jump scare at the very, very end that just doesn't work. But that's such a minor portion of the story. The rest is just eerie and creepy and well done. The next segment that I really love is called Bad Wolf Down. And this one, it's not the most original story, I would say. But it is the one that to me feels exactly like a Creepshow segment in the way it's stylized. Maybe not in the way its story is told. Although I do think there's a strong enough kind of like a revenge plot or that type of, without spoiling what it is, that I do think it would have fit in. It feels a little different, but it still works. But stylistically, I think Rob Schrab directed this episode, and my God, he blew it out of the water. Like, this episode feels, again, those gels in the background, the way that the people look into the camera, the lighting, the way that he handles it, the props, the outfits, the costumes, things like that, they feel like Creepshow. They have that right amount of cheese to them that kind of like lends into that, EC Comics style feel, and it just, stylistically, spot on. It is exactly what I wanted to see. And the final two segments I want to talk about very briefly actually are in the same episode. They are like companion pieces, which is funny because the first segment's called The Companion. But anyway, this should have been the first episode. I would have been hooked if this was episode 1 because it feels like Creepshow. This one is the most Creepshow, episode I can say. Again, maybe not always stylistically or maybe not always storytelling, but the balance is perfect in this one. I think that it's the closest we've gotten to these two segments coming together to feel like a Creepshow, cohesive thing. The Companion is, again, without going into spoilers, it definitely harkens back to that kind of morality tale in the sense that the bad guy gets their comeuppance in the end in a kind of like twisted way, and it delves into the supernatural aspect of what's going on, and it's hard to talk about without spoiling because I don't want to spoil the episode, but I think it is the most kind of one where by the end it felt like an old EC comic. It felt like something where like the twist at the end, I guess, is like, that's perfect. And on top of that, stylistically, it's pretty close to Creepshow's. They try to use some various lighting. There's a lot of contrasting colors and gels and things like that when things kind of get spooky or creepy. And again, it's not as strong visually as the Bad Wolf Down episode, but it's pretty darn close, and for a TV show, Creepshow adaptation, I think it works. And if they were to kind of go more in this direction, I'd be okay with that. I think it would feel enough like Creepshow that I'd be like, yeah, great, this is Creepshow. But it doesn't have to stick completely to what's been done before. The other half of this episode is called Lydia Lane's Better Half. And I will say, again, not the strongest stylistically, although it does kind of lean into some cool visuals and things like that. But in terms of the way the story unfolds, it is the perfect kind of... It reminds me a lot of, if you're familiar with the Creepshow movies, the last segment of Creepshow 2 is called The Hitchhiker, and it is... I believe that's what it's called. I think it's The Hitchhiker is the name of it, but it deals with Hitchhiker, so... that segment feels the most like this segment, and I think it's so simple in its storytelling, but it works so very well. And of course, it's a morality tale. You know, people get their comeuppance at the end and stuff. So good, so good. These two stories, The Companion and Lydia Lane, are just, it's the perfect episode of season 1. I think it is the strongest double feature, if you will. Now the rest of the episodes, except for one segment, range from good to okay. You know, some people really love some of the other segments. There's one in particular called The Finger that I know a lot of people really enjoyed. I liked aspects of it, but stylistically it didn't really feel like a Creepshow to me. But even your lesser episodes are going to have some cool special effects or some, you know, dark humor or things like that are going to kind of elevate the episode. There is one segment that I find not good, like, at all. And that segment is called The Man in the Suitcase. And it's... Now, again, this is my opinion. If you like this episode or this segment, that's totally cool. In fact, let me know why you like it. I'd love to hear some more opinions on it. But for me, sitting down to watch this episode, it is the most un-Creepshow-like segment that they have. It's very... the story doesn't feel like Creepshow. The tone doesn't feel like Creepshow. It feels like it's out of a totally different show. It doesn't even feel like they're trying to replicate Creepshow. If it weren't for a few exceptions where they do kind of use that, like, pop art style, like, background, and they do it a couple times very briefly in this episode, I would have felt like it was a totally different show I had accidentally, like, put on. I'm like, wait, what is this? The story doesn't work, the twist doesn't work, the characters are unlikable, but not in a fun way. Like Creepshow, you tend to have really unlikable characters, but you know that, like, oh, they're gonna kind of, like, you know, it's a morality tale, so they're gonna get what's coming to them, and it's not that at all. In fact, this is just, it's just, and then the ending is poorly put together. This episode feels rushed. It feels like they had an idea and they hadn't fully kind of figured it out, but they still wrote a script, and we're like, well, we need another segment, so let's do the story. It's bad. It's just, for me, it did not meet my criteria for what I wanted out of this show. Now, again, I've seen other lists where people rank this episode really, really high, and they say it's one of the best in the season. So maybe you'll enjoy it. To me, it just did not feel like Creepshow in any capacity. There was nothing about it, except for those few little moments and a few cool special effects at the end. It just didn't, it fell flat for me, and that's unfortunate. Overall, I think if you're a Creepshow fan, it's definitely worth watching season 1. Again, it's only 12 episodes. It's not that long. I binged watched it pretty quickly over the course of like a day and a half or something like that. And it's very digestible. It's easy. You can watch one segment, and you do know that when a bad segment ends, you know you've got another shot coming up because they're only about 22 minutes per segment. But that said, again, if you get an episode with 2 bad segments or 2 lame segments or whatever, it kind of makes the whole episode fall flat. But I think the show shows a lot of potential. Obviously, Greg Nicotero has a lot of respect for the people he's worked with, the people he knew, Romero and Savini. And the interviews I've seen with him seems to show that he doesn't take this lightly. He didn't just slap the name Creepshow on something and be like, it's Creepshow. He understands what he's working on and the legacy that these movies and now this TV show has. And I think that season 1 shows a lot of promise and a lot of, ultimately, overall respect to what came before it, and is trying to continue that legacy, but also bring it to a new audience as well. So if you haven't checked it out and you do have Shudder, definitely give it a watch. If you don't have Shudder, but you have AMC, definitely check it out too. I highly recommend it. Again, not every episode is a winner, but this is season 1. They seem to be finding their footing, and hopefully season 2 just kind of continues to elevate and bring in some better episodes. But you know what? I'm always just happy to get more Creepshow. But that's all I got for today's episode of Impromptu Reviews. So let me know, did you enjoy Creepshow? Have you watched it? What's your favorite segment? And if you want to see more videos like this, you can check out some other of my Impromptu reviews. I've got all kinds of movie and show reviews on there. You can also check out Fright Films, which is my horror movie analytical show. I think I am going to do some episodes down the road on Creepshow 1 and 2, so if you'd like to see those sooner rather than later, let me know in the comments too. You can check out food reviews, all kinds of cool stuff on the channel. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel. Helps us out and it lets me know what kind of content you like making. Leave a like on this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.